Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Madam Secretary. Thank you for being here. And as the Chairman alluded to, no subject is more emotional than educating our kids, and sometimes the emotion gets the best of us, and I'll try to keep my emotions aside today and just talk about the facts and ask a few questions. First, I was actually planning on talking about the reserve balances of the public schools in Pennsylvania, and the last gentleman had mentioned about the schools needing to draw down their fund balances, but I looked at a statistic this morning that showed that over last year, the fund balances for the public schools in Pennsylvania actually grew by $300 million to an estimated $3.5 or $3.8 billion, depending on what you look at. Are there any strings? Are there any? Does Harrisburg dictate to the school districts how much fund balances, reserve balances they must hold, or what that money can be used for?
It would depend on how that money was put into reserve. There are superintendents and school boards decide at some designated fund balance or unreserved fund balances, and so you'd have to go back and look at the board action when in fact that money was encumbered to put into the fund balance to see if there was strings attached to that. Okay. But not from Harrisburg.
And one of my frustrations as we continue to have the debate about whether or not we're spending enough, and I think you're right, how much is too much. We bicker back and forth whether the last year of the Rendell administration, when the state invested $8.9 billion versus today we're looking at a proposal of $10.3 billion. We can talk about all kinds of things, but if we look over the last 15 years and we look at the increase of administrative cost and professional staff over that period has increased by 40%, while the increase to teachers has only increased at 14%. As we go through these difficult times, and the frustration from my standpoint is that a lot of times the first decision in tough economic times is to lay off teachers. And when we're looking at school districts that every school district that has a superintendent and a business manager and a solicitor, in spite of all the technology over the last 15 years, can you comment as to whether or not school districts are looking at consolidating administrative services? Do we still have 500 superintendents, 500 business managers, 500 solicitors, executive assistants for the majority of those positions? Have school districts looked at consolidating their central offices?
I think there have been efforts, at least I know back when I was sitting in the seat, that we were looking at consolidated services. So we did bulk purchasing. We looked at transportation services that we could work together, so we didn't have buses, just especially to non-public schools, crossing each other's lines. We looked at consolidating services for, again, as I said, purchases for technology. One of the strengths that we have in Pennsylvania is local control, but it's also probably one of the constraints that we have in addition to football teams and mascots. So I would say, it depends on the willingness of those local communities to look at merger. The department helps and supports those who are honestly interested in looking at that. And there are, as we know, there are school districts that have, when they were created, had very robust economies. And those economies, because of either steel mills or coal mines or whatever, have disappeared or changed. And we stand ready at the department to help those who would like to look at mergers, that would look at consolidations, to help them through that.
And while the 15th district, we have we're very proud of having the first voluntary merger. I'm not even, the school districts, the number of school districts is one thing, but from the number of superintendents and business managers and some of the most expensive positions and ones that have the least interaction with the kids in the classroom, I feel like Harrisburg should be incentivizing or studying the cost, the impact of those expenses, as well as should be encouraging school districts to not just lay off teachers. And because of the seniority rules in Pennsylvania, sometimes we may be laying off some of the best and the brightest and most talented teachers because they have the least amount of seniority. So thank you for your commitment to looking at that. We talk a lot about testing nowadays and the number of days that kids are testing. I'm not sure how many days my parents tested when they were in K through 12, or I don't even remember how many days I were subject to standardized tests, but clearly it's increased over the last few years, a decade. And can you comment on the average number of days that educators are having to not prepare for, but specifically to do the test?
Yes, to prepare for is a year-long process of delivering curriculum.
Right.
So I would say that we often, people will give me charts that will show, look at all the days of testing and say that it's 2 weeks worth of testing. What we try to do is to provide school districts with flexibility on when to give, when to give those tests. So those 2 weeks, and now we've obviously extended based on districts asking us to push back the testing window, that it will look like now it's 4 weeks of testing, but you pick those days in between. Since the tests aren't timed, and I think that people don't realize that our PSSA tests are not timed tests, so students can have as much time as they need to finish the test, especially if there are accommodations being given to students. It's hard to say how long does the test last. But for example, in PSSA tests, there usually are 3 modules of math and 3 modules of reading. And usually they're 45-minute modules. Again, it would depend on the accommodations that were being given or students who would need more time. So it's hard to say average what it is, but it's usually a few days of testing that people go through.
And I have heard the number of 11 to 12 days on average, 2 weeks of instructional days that are lost. My concern is that those numbers of days, 10, 12, 11, 8 days we're losing of instructional days that used to be in the calendar. Mm-hmm. So if it's still 180 days a year and now we have 10 less instructional days, is the department looking at extending the school year to cover those that loss of instructional days? I know that Governor Christie recently talked about kids going to school more hours a day, more days a year. Is the department looking at the benefits of what that decision would mean?
Let me make sure that I understand what you're asking me. Are you asking me if this year, because of...
No. I'm sorry. This year is an exception. I saw the local article about the extension this year, but based on previous years, we're losing about 8 to 12 days of instructional days per year due to additional testing. Have you looked at extending the school year to recoup those loss of instructional days due to the increased testing days?
Well, first of all, I believe testing is part of assessment and part of the curricular process. So I'm not sure it's lost instruction. It's in fact the measure of whether we know whether the delivery of instruction worked. So it's all that written, taught, and tested is all part of the instructional cycle. I do want to go back and before I give you an answer on the 8 to 12 days of testing, I'd really like to go back and check that data to see, in fact, whether that's what we're talking about is the calendar or the actual time that students are sitting taking the test. But I'll check that piece of data for you.
And I think it's an important clarification. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Chairman, one final point that I would like to ask the Secretary is, recently in the Beaver County Times, if I could just quote them, they said, "There's gigantic holes that permeate the laws and efforts in the state level seem to be working towards more restrictive access of information rather than less restrictions on folks in the media or the public accessing data." And I'm specifically looking at the financial data of school districts. The state now puts every single penny that the state spends online, which I think was a huge reform. The right to know law has been manipulated by some on a local level in all different settings. We've read about all kinds of misuse of taxpayer funds in cyber schools and public schools in Beaver County. Is the department committed to getting away from the antiquated right-to-know process and supporting an effort to put all school spending online so that folks don't have to jump through hoops and the media doesn't have to wait 30 days to see just traditional spending of taxpayer money?
I think that this administration is committed to transparency, and I think we've proven that in our school performance profile, where we've made a very transparent building-by-building comparison for achievement, graduation, all the components of what makes a healthy school building. I think if in fact we could agree on what are those common factors that everyone has so that we could report those, and without a lot more data mining or data requests from school districts, that we have this, our school performance profile, which could, in fact, include financial information. The key that I would like to say is we need to make sure that it's data that's common across all districts so that we can make common, just like we did with the academic score, if you will, that there are common items that we could post, and then things that we already collect and we could format. So I'd be happy to have that conversation continuing with you if you'd like.
I think that's a fair request on your behalf, and I would agree that this administration has been very committed to financial data transparency, and I look forward to working with you on the other initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.